Hello, I am Chef Jones from the Auguste Escoffier School of Culinary Arts in Austin, Texas. Thank you so much for joining me in my kitchen. On the menu for today, we have a salted chocolate caramel corn tart. Yes, you heard that correct. And you're very welcome. Yeah. Our tart has three components to it. Component number one is going to be our pâte sablé. A pâte sablé is a crumbly, kind of sandy, it actually translates to sand, tart. That texture of the crust is actually really needed with the caramel because it kind of holds on to it and keeps it in place. Component number two being our caramel, actually our caramel corn, yum. This has a great balance of sweet, salty, bitter, buttery, all wrapped up into one. So it kind of hits all of your taste buds at one powerful bite. It's delicious. And then we're going to top it with a chocolate ganache and sprinkle it with a little fleur de sel, nice flaky salt. This helps to enhance the flavor of the chocolate and the flavor of the caramel, the flavor of that kind of bitter, dark, sweet crust. And just brings it all together into one delicious flavor bomb of a bite. Are you ready? Is your mouth watering like mine is? Let's get started. So we are going to start with our crust first. This one is a little bit different than what you may be accustomed to. If you've made an American style pie crust, then you know the goal is to have nice flaky layers in that crust. With the pâte sablé, we don't really want the flakes. We are gonna have a nice buttery texture. It's very similar to a shortbread. So it's kind of more of a shortbread crust, which buttery, delicious, you're not going to be disappointed. But the main difference is that we're starting with room temperature butter instead of cold butter. We want this butter to incorporate fully throughout your dough, and we don't want those pockets of chunks of butter like we're used to with an American style pie crust, because we want a nice even crust. We don't necessarily want those flakes in there. So we have a stick and a half of room temperature butter that we're going to start with. And to that, we're going to add powdered sugar. The powdered sugar we want because we don't want those larger granules of the granulated sugar. We want it to be a nice fine powder. Again, making sure that everything is evenly and thoroughly dispersed throughout our dough. So that'll be a half a cup plus 1 tablespoon icing sugar, powdered sugar going in. We're going to combine this until evenly dispersed, nice and soft and creamed through perfectly. Always want to start it first on a lower setting, just so you don't get a facial of powdered sugar, and then increase it once it starts to get incorporated with that butter. Nice and light in color. We want it to be kind of thick and airy, fluffy texture in our butter and sugar mixture. All right, while that is going, I'm actually going to go ahead and combine my dry ingredients. So I have here all-purpose or AP flour, and we're going to add 1.5 cups of all-purpose flour. To that, we have Dutch processed cocoa. This is nice and rich, gives more of a velvety texture on your tongue. Just rich, dark chocolate, which is what we want in that pie crust. Or that tart crust, I should say. We also have salt. Salt is essential in this recipe. We can't have all sweet and no salt to cut it. The salt is actually working to, one, offset the sweetness of our pie dough, all that sugar that we put in there, as well as the sweetness in the dessert itself. And it also helps to enhance the flavors that are there. So it's actually going to make our butter taste a little more buttery. It's going to make our chocolate taste a little more richer, a little more chocolatey. So it's definitely necessary. And we're actually adding a 1/4 teaspoon of kosher salt into the mixture there. Give it a mix around, just to make sure we're thoroughly combined evenly. All right, we have those set. So once you have a nice cream on your butter and sugar mixture. We're gonna add in the wet ingredients next. And for this recipe, we have 1 tablespoon of vanilla extract. And we also have 2 egg yolks that we're gonna add in there as well. Mix again until thoroughly combined. We don't want to see any streaks of vanilla. We don't want to see any streaks of egg. We want it to be one cohesive mixture. All right, I'm gonna take this opportunity to kind of scrape down my bowl. Again, making sure we don't have any pockets of butter without any vanilla or egg in there. No pieces of egg or streaks of egg throughout our dough. All right, and next we're gonna start to work in our dry ingredients. Mixer on low. Again, because we don't want a facial of chocolate and all-purpose flour. And we're gonna mix this until we no longer see any dry spots in our dough. We wanna make sure all that flour and cocoa is thoroughly absorbed with that butter mixture. Low speed until we get that dry bombs that could be there of the flour, and then we can increase it slowly to speed number 2. And again, we don't want to overwork our dough because that'll make for a tough dough, but we want to make sure we don't have any dry spots in there. And this is a dough that is very forgiving because we don't have to actually roll this dough out, which is one of the reasons why I love it so. We're basically just gonna plop it in there and force it into place. And again, you don't have to worry about flouring or spraying down your pie tin because there's so much butter in here, it's not gonna stick. It's gonna pop right off. I have here a dish with a little bit of flour and a flat bottomed cup. This is gonna help to make sure I get nice even coverage on my pie crust. Actually, I'm gonna start a little bit with my hands. Get a little flour in there. And just kind of press it out. It is gonna be sticky, so don't be afraid to use that flour. All right, we're working it to get it to the edge. And once we get it to the edge, we can start to actually flatten it out. And I reserved a bit in the bowl so that I can patch any spots that may be looking a little thin, or if I have any tears, I have something to go to fix those little tears. So again, flour on the bottom. And just press it out. I like to start in the middle, kind of start to thin that out, and then work my way to the edges. So just working that little lip kind of up the sides. And I definitely am gonna need the rest of that dough to give me a nice full side. You want to make sure you're getting in all those little crevices, pressing it up nice and tight against that so you get that nice fluted edge for presentation. So we're using, like I said, a pâte sablé. You could also go for a pâte sucrée. That one has a crisper texture to it when it's baked. I like the sandier texture with the caramel especially. But the pâte sucrée, if you're into more of a crisp cookie crunch on the outside of your tart, then that's a great option to go with. I'm just gonna grab a knife and I'm gonna kind of clean up those edges and use that to fill in on this side. Lovely. Also, I didn't mention, but if you didn't want to use the flour to prevent your fingers from sticking, you could always use additional cocoa. I like the flour. I don't mind it. It's actually gonna bake off quite a bit once it's in the oven. We're going to take a fork. We're gonna press or pierce the crust of our dough to kind of ensure that it doesn't kind of flake up or bubble up on us. We want it to have a nice flat layer to it. And yes, these holes will fill as it bakes, so you don't have to worry about your filling kind of seeping through and underneath. I do also like to prick the sides. Because on occasion, you can get some bubbles in there as well. So I have my oven preheated to 350 degrees. It's gonna take this about 25 minutes to cook. So we're actually gonna start it in the oven. I'm gonna put a parchment paper down, and you can put a pie weight or a smaller pan that'll fit inside of here to kind of hold it down again to prevent that bubbling. You're gonna bake it that way for about 15 to 20 minutes. Then we're gonna take that insert out and let it finish baking for another 5 to 10 minutes, just depending on your oven. So we have our tart shell in the background just cooling off. So we're gonna get started making our caramel. This is the fun part. I prefer to use a wet caramel method versus a dry sugar method, or wet sugar versus a dry sugar, mainly because it gives me just a little bit more control over preventing crystals from forming when crystallizing my sugar. So we're gonna start first with 1.5 cups of granulated sugar into my pot. To that, I'm actually gonna add, using that wet cooking or that wet sugar method, I'm gonna add some water, only about 1/2 cup going in. I like to take it around the edge to kind of make sure that I don't have any sugar on the sides of my pot, and then take it to the center. I just want to dissolve as much as I can now. Just under 1/2 cup. Next up, we're gonna add in some corn syrup, just a light corn syrup, 3 tablespoons worth. This acts as kind of another safe net to ensure I don't get any crystals when I'm caramelizing my sugar. Because we're using hygroscopic and hygroscopic sugar, it's gonna hold on to moisture, which will make kind of a safe net for me when I'm making my caramel. At this stage, we're okay to do a little bit of mixing. We don't want to slosh it around too much, but I do want to make sure that all those granules of the granulated sugar are moistened and are starting to dissolve. And making sure I don't have anything stuck to the sides of my pot either. I want to make sure we get a nice even melt on those. All right, now we're at the fun part. Yay, the fun part. We get to wait for our sugar to start to caramelize. This honestly can take as much time as it needs to take. The sugar is dictating the show right now. We cannot force this to happen when we want it to. We just gotta wait and see. I am gonna wait until I start to see that I have no longer solid piece, no longer any granules left in my pot of the sugar. I want it all to be nice and dissolved. And once I start to see a little bit of caramelization occur inside the pot, I'm gonna add in my candy thermometer. We're wanting our sugar mixture to hit about 340 on the scale, which is caramel set. And once it hits 340, then we'll start to add in the rest of our ingredients to give us a nice, smooth, rich caramel to go with our tart. We're having a lot of action happening on this pan. You may have to adjust the position of the pan if you have hot spots on your stove. You may want to rotate it around just to make sure you're getting even heating throughout the entire pot. I'm just going to give it a rotate. While I am waiting for my sugar to start caramelizing, I'm seeing a little bit of tanning slightly happening, but we're not quite ready for the thermometer yet. I have my popcorn here. This is just microwavable popcorn. I like kettle corn. You could also use the movie theater butter if you want that rich, super rich buttery flavor, which I am not mad at you if you do. I just want to go through my popped popcorn and make sure I don't have any of the unpopped kernels going into my tart, because that's a horrible surprise to give someone. So you can go over your popcorn, give it a nice little rough chop to get small pieces. I actually like the larger kernels of popcorn, so I'm going to leave it as is. These are pretty much mostly the same, virtually the same in size. So we should be fine there. So we're at a stage where we're seeing a lot of tight bubbles happening in our sugar. Basically what we were waiting for in the beginning. We wanted that water that I added in there to evaporate from the sugar, and then it'll start to caramelize the sugar. We got to wait for that water to evaporate before we start to get caramelization. So it takes a little bit longer to caramelize your sugar when you're doing the wet sugar method, but I'm okay with that because it makes sure that I don't get the crystals forming when I'm making my caramel. I'm starting to see a slight change in color. We're getting a little beige, a little eggshell in there. So I'm gonna prep my thermometer, get my thermometer ready. We're going for that 340 degrees on the caramel. That gives us a caramel state. Anything before that will give us a hard crack, essentially, in our caramel, which means it won't be nice and soft and easy to cut through. It'll be firmer and actually more like caramel candy instead of a caramel sauce consistency. So we want to make sure, this is not something we can skip on, we want to make sure we get it up to about that 340 degrees so we ensure that we have a nice pourable but still solid caramel in our tart. So I'm going to go ahead and insert my thermometer. And we're off to the races. It's already starting to rise immediately, as it should. And honestly, the hardest part is just waiting for it to hit that 340 degrees. It kind of stalls. It tends to stall around that 280 to 320 range and kind of just holds there for a while. And then it'll start to rise on its own. So just be patient with your sugar and let it do what it needs to do. Because it's going to reward you greatly with a delicious tart. Okay, so if you can see in the pot here, you'll notice that we have some browning happening kind of on one side of the pot. So we want to give it a gentle rotate just to disperse that hot sugar a little more evenly around the pot. And just a gentle swirl every now and then to make sure that it's evenly cooking. All right, so we're in that hover zone. It's at around 310-ish right now. Remember, we're going up to 340. So just keep an eye on it. This is not the time to go answer the phone, go answer the door. You want to stay close by because your sugar goes from caramelized, perfectly done, to burnt in the blink of an eye. So we want to make sure that we have our next ingredients prepped and ready. Our heavy cream as well as our butter and a little bit of salt as well. So that as soon as this hits temperature, we're dumping it in and stopping the cooking process. That's our goal. And 340, turn the heat off. I'm gonna add in my salt and my butter. When adding this in, it's gonna kind of bubble up on you a little bit. Don't be shy. Just be cautious. You don't want to burn yourself because this will make a severe burn. And then we're going to add in our cream as well. making sure we get all that salt in there. Again, that salt helps to enhance the flavor of our finished product. It helps to offset a lot of that sugar that we have in here, that 1.5 cups of sugar that's in there. It makes it a bit more palatable and not all sweet on your palate. Look at that liquid gold. Yum, yum, yum. Again, please be careful when working with sugar. It does burn quite easily, and it will stick to your skin and continue to burn. So just use caution. Don't slosh it around too much. By the way, that was about 3/4 of a cup of heavy cream that I put in there, and 6 tablespoons of butter. This is not a diet dessert. We're packing on some calories here. But this is also a very rich dessert as well. You're not gonna eat a whole tart. You just can't, you physically can't. It's too rich, which is one of the reasons why I enjoy it. You get that sweet bite without having to have an entire slice of cake to satisfy your sweet tooth. All right. Lovely. All right, we have our popcorn here. We're gonna start to incorporate this into our caramel. And we have caramel corn. If that's not a treat in and of itself, just take a spoon to this. We have our tart shell here. I'm gonna start by kind of spooning in a little bit of that popcorn to get good coverage, so it's not all piled up into one spot. I like the amount of caramel that I have, of popcorn that I have in there, so I'm kind of holding back a little bit of it. I want to make sure we're still able to get a nice even layer of ganache after this cools. Next thing is we're going to allow this to cool and set up so that caramel isn't so sloshy in there. Just let it set up. Just put it again, just let it go at room temperature and let the caramel kind of give us a nice base for us to add our next ingredient, which is going to be the ganache. All right, we've reached the last step. We're working on the chocolate ganache now. So I have a bowl sitting over a pot of water, warm water, and I'm just gonna add my chocolate chips. I'm using bittersweet chocolate chips. This will give me that nice balance, you know, a little bit of bitterness to offset a lot of that sugar that's in the caramel. So it's gonna create a nice even flavor instead of just a spike of sugar going up. With that, we're gonna add some heavy cream. As I said before, this is not a low-fat dish. And we're just going to melt our chocolate into the cream. This shouldn't take very long. As you can see, we already have some chocolate melting now. And I typically add salt to this mixture, to my ganache, but I'm gonna hold off, mainly because I'm gonna add salt on the top of the finished tart, and I don't wanna make it too salty. And if you're finding that your ganache is a little too runny, you can always just add more chocolate to it, or if it's too stiff, the other way, add more heavy cream to it. So I reserved a bit of my heavy cream just in case I needed to thin it out a little bit. I'm just gonna reduce the heat. And we're just gonna stir until it gets nice and smooth. We don't want any chunks of chocolate. We don't want any streaks of cream. And I'm gonna add a bit more of that cream. So all in all, I added about 1/2 cup of heavy cream to about 4 ounces, 4.5 ounces of chocolate chips. And if you can see just over my shoulder, we have our tart pretty much ready to go. That caramel, I'm gonna remove my ganache from these. That caramel has set up on our tart. So it is ready for my chocolate. I am gonna allow this to cool slightly. So I'm gonna give it about 10 minutes, stirring off and on for that 10 minutes, just to kind of cool the ganache off of it. And then I'll pour it over the tart, let it set up, so more waiting, and then we can jump into it. All right, we have our ganache slightly chilled. Oh, look at that. A river of chocolate. Nothing's better. If you weren't watching me right now, I would be licking the spoon, but I have manners. All right, so we're gonna top our tart with this ganache. And I wanna start by kind of rotating it by hand. I wanna get it as smooth as possible. Just to give me a good base. Now I can kind of push it out to the edges. And as it sits and cools, it'll kind of flatten out a little bit more as well. And with that being said, yes, we do have to wait a little while longer. We just want to wait until that ganache gets a chance to set up. But we are almost there. I'm trying to keep my crust clear. There we go. All right, we'll wait for this to set up and then I'll show you the finishing touches. All right, our chocolate ganache has set up on the top of our tart. And now we're just gonna do the finishing touches, which is use a little fleur de sel. You could also use molten sea salt. You want those larger flakes, those larger chunks of salt. It just looks nicer on the top. And plus you get that nice salty bite when you bite into the tart. So just for garnish sake, we're just gonna go around the edge, kind of give a ring of salt. And then once I cut into it, or once you serve, you can add a little extra salt per slice. But I like the look of this. Thank you so much for joining me in my kitchen to make this beautiful salted chocolate caramel corn tart. I hope you take the opportunity to make it yourself as well. Again, I am Chef Jones from the Auguste Escoffier School of Culinary Arts in Austin, Texas. Thank you so much for joining me in my kitchen.